Hello, I'm Craig Dunn. I'm Dean of the College of Business and Economics here at Western Washington University, and delighted to have with me Tim Smith, who is with Walden Asset Management. More about him in just a moment. This program is sponsored by the Center for Innovation and Education and also by the Wilder Distinguished Professorship, which was made possible by a gift from Wilder Construction some 2 decades ago now. So, a little bit about the organization for which Tim works. He is the director of ESG. I don't like using acronyms, and a lot of people don't know what those acronyms stand for, but we'll get to that in just a moment. And so Walden Asset Management is a part of a division of Boston Trust and Investment Management Company, which has under management about $8 billion. Roughly half of that is within the Walden Asset Management Fund. Let me read you just a bit about that fund. It says, as the oldest institutional investment manager in the sustainable and responsible investment SRI industry, Walden has unparalleled experience managing portfolios for clients who seek wise stewardship of their assets as well as social and environmental impacts through their investments. So can you elaborate on that and tell us what is ESG and what is your job?
So ESG is short for environmental, social, and governance issues. So investors who are committed to sustainable investing, we're trying to be responsible investors.
No, sustainable.
So we're trying to make sure that as we invest money for clients, it could be an individual, could be an institution. Mm-hmm. For example, the state of Washington is one of our clients. We manage a special fund that provides a socially responsible investment option for employees of the state. And so we would integrate these environmental, social, and governance factors into the investment process. Mm-hmm. So we're not just looking at the numbers of a company. We're looking at what their record is on the environment. How do they treat employees? What their supply chain is like. So all of these issues get blended in to the investment process and also into the engagement process as we reach out to companies and try to engage them as owners, as share owners.
Which could include advocacy, and we'll come back to that. We've had long discussions about the word sustainability on this campus, and it's fascinating to me where we kind of settle, because I think when people use that term, they generally think environment, but you can't have, when I think about business, you can't have smoothly functioning business enterprises in war-torn regions of the world or where there is widespread famine. So when we think about sustainability, we're thinking about peace and justice as well as environment and other social consequences or issues. Is that how you use the word sustainable?
Well said. Certainly, I think any investment firm or pension fund or foundation or university that talks about sustainability in investments is doing exactly what you're doing. They're looking at the breadth of issues, sustainability issues or corporate responsibility issues. Sometimes companies would talk that way. And if you talk to companies these days who say we strive to be leaders in sustainability, they have that whole breadth of issues you just talked about. The environment, employees, what our supply chain is like. Are we buying from companies that may be using sweatshop labor or being unsafe places to work? So that in the corporate and investment world, sustainability would have the breadth you just described.
And yet the term gets used in different ways. I've talked over the last couple of years of being dean, I talk about our ambition to create sustainable market-based revenue streams in support of our mission. And that means something very different, because sustainable in that context means something that over time will be stable, a stable source of revenue.
And any company that talks about sustainability over time is also talking about, will it thrive as a company over time?
So let me, I did want to mention too, another role you play is you're on the Sustainability Advisory Board of Kimberly-Clark. And what is the role of that advisory board?
So for 8 years, Kimberly-Clark's been a leader in bringing some outsiders to talk to top management of the company about sustainability issues. So it would be everything from helping identify issues that are key cutting-edge issues for the future that we might not have thought of 10 years ago, to saying, well, what does it mean to be a leader in sustainability, say, with your supply chain, looking at the companies that sell you goods and products. How do you try to influence them to be responsible and sustainable too? So this group of 5 or 6 people, it's varied over time, comes from a variety of backgrounds. And to its credit, Kimberly Clark, at the top management level, we meet with the CEO in an ongoing way, as well as the CFO and the top management team. They're not only open to listen, they are quite open to push back too. It should be a dialogue, right?
Right.
But they're also open to make changes as requested.
Well, I think one of the most important points you just made is that you have access to the very senior executive team of the organization, and failing that, you probably wouldn't have the impact that you're.
We could be siloed, right? In a company, you potentially could be siloed.
Have you been on that board long enough to know at its inception, was there a champion for setting up that board?
Well, certainly the CEO was a champion of the concept.
Okay.
It was untested, and there were certainly sustainability staff that championed the process of not only getting input from outsiders, but being able to bring their whole broad sustainability team. There's lots of people working on diversity or human rights or the environment, and bringing them together adds value to the company too, because we have a cross-fertilization of ideas. So yes, I think it is important to have it being supported at the top level of a company, and then have champion or champions who are going to make sure it works.
Right. Well, let's just wade right into one of the more controversial aspects of this topic of ESG, and that has to do with campus divestment initiatives.
Okay.
Certainly here at Western, I mean, this happens to be our Back to Bellingham weekend. It's an annual event when we invite alums and other community members to campus, and we have just a broad range of very interesting activities, many of which are educational, going on. Now, if you unwind the clock about 2 years, Bill McKibben was on campus. At the time, he was with 360.org, is no longer. And he filled our Performing Arts Center. Probably 1,000+ people were there. To hear him talk about a phrase you haven't yet used, nor have I, fossil fuel free. And so a group of students have petitioned to have divestment from fossil fuel related stocks in the foundation's portfolio, which, as you know, is a separate entity from the university proper. I guess my first question would be, is fossil fuel free a possibility?
Oh, it's certainly a possibility. We have dozens of clients who have chosen, in fact, one client going back 15 years, a foundation in Seattle, who was an environmental foundation and just decided from the outset it didn't want to own stock in fossil fuels. So it's doable, and I can say in this case, since we have a track record of 15 years, we've been getting competitive returns too. So it's not only doable, it can be done in a way that is financially responsible too. So I think that the fossil fuel free, the divestment debate, has had a tremendous impact globally, not just in our country, and not just on college campuses. Religious groups and cities and states are discussing this issue. And of course the issue behind it is, what's the role of the fossil fuel industry in exacerbating climate change, and what's our responsibility if we happen to own shares in those companies? So I think Bill McKibben has done a great service by raising the climate crisis and reminding us the clock is ticking, and he continues to do that around the world in a very, very effective way. He focused in on the strategy of selling stock as a way of sending a message, and he's championed the idea of having 200 companies that you wouldn't invest in as a statement. And as I said, a number of institutions have decided that's the right and, for them, moral way to go.
So in this conversation about fossil fuel free, what I'm puzzled by is how far you go with that. In other words, what about a plastics company? I mean, are they in the fossil fuel free category or not?
Right. So I think the important thing to say, and I think Bill McKibben would say this too, this is not a search for purity in one's investments. It's an impossible search if you look for it. So, of course, there's going to be trade-offs, and you may own stock in some companies that you have questions about, and you may not invest in some companies that actually are doing a fairly decent role. They're a small company, but they happen to be on a list. So, as we talk about divestment, let's talk about globally what the categories are. So, there is this category category where a list of 200 companies has been named, and a foundation, for example, or a religious group can say, I'm signing up, I'm signing the pledge, and I refuse to invest in those 200 companies. But numerous investment entities have decided to focus on coal first as one of the dirtiest fossil fuels, of course. So I'm on the pension board of the United Methodist Church. It's a fairly large fund, about $22 billion, over 100 years old. And they decided last year to make the decision not to invest any further or any longer in coal companies, which is a very smart investment decision since 4 out of 5 coal companies have just gone bankrupt, right? So what we've seen in the last year is a huge international acknowledgement that this is a wise investment choice, as well as a statement about the environment. A second approach that we and many other investment firms have done for decades is basically looking at a company's record, in this case on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, and not investing in companies that are on the lower tiers, but maybe investing in companies that we consider best in class. So in that case, you would have investors who would be trying to lessen the term they would use, their carbon footprint, but at the same time, it's not an approach where they said, I wouldn't own 200 companies.
Right.
So, and then...
So you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, right?
That's certainly a phrase I try to live by. At the same time, I do want to say that, and it sounds like it's a contradiction, but it may not be, that in institutions who have decided to divest and make this very strong moral statement are also part of the message that's being sent to society and to the fossil fuel companies. What I would say that I think might differ with where some of the divestment advocates are is both those who have decided to divest and send that message and investors who are gathered together to put pressure on not just fossil fuel companies, on themselves and the whole stock market are also an important voice to be listened to. So I'll give you a quick factoid. When the Paris Accord was signed recently, there was a statement the week before by global investors with $24 trillion of assets under management.
It's enormous.
It is enormous. It's calling on companies to change, calling on governments to act. So here are investors not being quiet stockholders, just clipping dividend coupons, so to speak, and making money, but that they are taking their responsibility and their voice as an investor seriously. So I think those voices can be, there's a synergy with those and those who are calling for divestment to say we really need to rethink the assumptions we're operating under.
So that's, I mean, that you've brought up a couple points that they beg for elaboration, right? I mean, exclusionary versus inclusionary criteria when it comes to investing. So divestment is exclusionary. We're going to not invest in certain investment instruments. But inclusionary is, these are the things we want to invest in.
Very good point.
Right.
So traditionally, going back hundreds of years now, there have been lists of stocks, some people joke and call them sin stocks.
Right.
I'm not going to invest in tobacco, I'm not going to invest in pornography, I'm not going to invest in maybe alcohol.
Are there saint stocks?
Well, there are some that you would stand up and say, this company is really an outstanding leader. Not a saint, meaning without flaw, but yes, stands above others. But those lists of exclusionary categories, again, have history. It's like Quakers are never going to invest in gun companies, never did, right? You understand their values lead them to say, I choose not to make that investment, even if I could make money from it. United Methodist never owned tobacco, never will. So I think those are important screens to have in place, but what's happened in the last decade, terribly important, because the criticism of that, it's called socially responsible investing, is it's just a no list. What won't you invest in? What's happened is investors with literally, and I say this advisedly, trillions of dollars of assets are analyzing companies and looking at companies that have a positive record that they choose to invest invest in. And now we're not talking about firms like ourselves. We're talking about Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase, and these are firms that understand this issue and say ESG, environmental, social, governance issues, matter, but it matters to the bottom line, and it matters to risk. So we're looking at these issues as we manage our portfolio because we're smart, not because we're maybe starting from an environmental perspective.
Right, and there's a really important distinction that I heard you make. I mean, on the one hand, investors might say, we're not going to invest in gun stocks because we have a value for being pacifists, irrespective of return. And that's very different than saying we're not going to invest in coal companies because it's a bad financial bet. Right? And that brings up the question of whether or not motives matter, right? I mean,
or what if you can say I'm not investing in coal companies for multiple reasons, starting with the one you mentioned and then saying, and by the way, I would have looked at them first anyway because the greenhouse gas emissions are so horrendous, and oil sands is soon thereafter. But it is a different approach, you're absolutely right. But for many institutions, they blend. They're not like a contradiction. Again, most of our clients are glad that they're not investing in guns or tobacco or whatever, but they expect we need to move far beyond that in choosing companies for their portfolio.
I mean, the easy cases are the ones in which the financial incentives and the moral or ethical or social incentives align, because that becomes a no-brainer. You can sell that to anyone.
And this is a tough one. CalPERS, California Public Employees Retirement System, right now is being pushed to look at the fact, should they buy tobacco stocks again? Because years ago they divested, and they have some critics who are saying, you left $1 billion on the table. And is it your legal and fiduciary duty to own those shares, even if you don't like what they're doing? Whereas others would, as I said before, would just say, well, I'm not going there. Or CalPERS or CalSTRS would say, I choose not to own gun companies, not because they're pacifists, but because after Newtown in Connecticut, the massacre, they didn't want to own companies that were selling the guns that were used in that massacre.
Because they were perceived as being higher risk.
Well, there was risk, but also in that sense, a moral outrage came in.
That's true.
The teachers of California said, I just don't feel comfortable with this. I don't want this in my portfolio. It's my money, after all, they said.
Well, CalPERS is an interesting example, aren't they? Because I think they're probably still the largest share owner in the country. I know at one point they were.
Fund.
Yeah, they're and they know who they represent too. I mean, CalPERS, the California Professional Employee Retirement System. I'm a retiree from that system and have gone to one or more of their meetings, and they have a clear sense of the composition of the membership of that pension system, and that the membership tends to be more liberal than conservative, and so I think that influence more socially progressive in their composition. Is it appropriate then? I mean, when you come to this question about tobacco and should reinvestment be made in tobacco, is it appropriate for them to say, we're looking to our membership and they don't just want the best financial return, they have other values that we should be factoring into our investment decisions?
Certainly as part of the equation, and the battle within any institution, not picking on CalPERS on that, is what's their legal responsibility too, because it's not their money. It's your money, right? They're trying to take care of it for your future, and therefore they feel they have a responsibility to protect your long-term financial return. Do you have investments also with TIA? So there's another example, a Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, huge funds who actually have the biggest, they call it social investment portfolio in the country. And they have, again, professors who choose that choice.
That's where it's different than CalPERS, right? Because, I mean, in TIAA, half of mine goes into that social responsible fund, and the other half goes into commercial real estate. And I make that decision because it's self-directed. but it's not self-directed with CalPERS.
Very good choice. And let me hasten to say, with your real estate investments, TIA, we're talking about sustainability and the breadth of definition. TIA has been a real leader in pressing companies they invest in, real estate entities, right, to make sure their operations are run in an environmentally responsible way, as well as other ways.
Right.
So they're back to, I'm not just investing in better in class, I'm actually going to invest in people that are making a difference, entities that are making a difference in the real estate market. And they're very proud of it, as they should be.
Well, I think the CalPERS example might shift our attention just a bit to this question about commingled funds. Because one of the challenges that's emerged as I've gotten to understand these investments better is that if you're investing in a commingled fund, then you have less leverage, it seems, and that can be a real barrier to implementing ESG. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, it's a different situation. You're exactly right to describe it as such. We have a little experience with this because we run mutual funds, but also separate accounts, right, individual accounts. So people who put money in the mutual fund, they are not owners of the stock in the mutual fund. They're owners of the fund that we are managing on their behalf, right?
Right.
So that's a commingled fund, but it's a mutual fund. But I think what's happening quite creatively now is in the university community and in foundations that use commingled funds, we are seeing a subset of a discussion. What can we do and what is our responsibility as an investor in those commingled funds? Because there's a lot of discomfort in saying, well, I've just outsourced all my moral, social, environmental concern as a commingled fund. I have nothing. Basically, my job's over. Ain't so. Whether you're an investor in Vanguard in one of their funds, or in, say, a very good set of funds for the academic and foundation community, the Common Fund. So. Let's give an example here of the chief financial officer of Yale, who 2 years ago, and then this last year, as he announced they had moved away from coal as well, back to your earlier point, basically instructed all their money managers to say, by the way, we, the owner, I forget if it's 17 billion, anyway, it's a significant university portfolio, you have not taken adequate account into the risk of climate change in our portfolio, in our money.
Right.
You're not, in other words, you got to do some more work. You're not taking care of us well, and you're missing opportunity to invest in positive things that bring about change, but also are money makers for us. And that was an example of a CFO who was basically saying to their managers of all sorts, here's what I expect of you. Now that would be true if that manager was a single account, a separate account, or a commingled account. If you're a commingled account manager, you are recognizing that all your constituents maybe are expecting new things from you now than they did 10 years ago, right? And the new things are not just make me as much money as you can, and it doesn't matter how. Look at who I am. I'm a university, I'm a foundation, I have specific concerns, and I expect you to be hearing those and telling us how you're going to address them. So we have numerous commingled funds that are looking at their carbon footprint, for example, and seeing ways to reducing it, or may have decided also not to invest in tobacco, just to use that as an example. So commingled fund can be just like a mutual fund, can be very responsive to this whole sustainability discussion. And the owner of the commingled fund, or a participant in it, let's use that term, can certainly have a conversation with the managers of the commingled fund saying, well, here's our concerns. Tell me what you're doing. Please, as you report to us, I want a report on how you're addressing the climate issue. And by the way, how are you voting your proxies? And I wanted to let you know that even though I don't own the shares in the commingled fund, when I'm going to sign some open statements and letters on climate change as an investor who's participating in the market through that commingled fund. So a commingled fund client can certainly be a very public name in speaking out on issues. The state of Washington itself, for example, very strong in speaking out on climate change with other investors, even though they have separate managers running those accounts.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fundamental question that we have to resolve, bring it back to our campus, and how much of a lever do we have? I mean, when you're talking about billions of dollars in endowments versus 80 million, I think in round numbers that's where we're at here at Western. Isn't that a much smaller lever or hammer that we have?
Well, the leverage is also the prestige of who you are. The logic, yes, exactly right. The logic you bring to the table. In other words, is it a trend that you're naming? In other words, you're not just a fringe voice, but by the way, let me point you to 20 other investors that are talking the same language. And my bet is a commingled fund such as the one you use is hearing from other clients as well.
Right.
And I know, because I've heard them speak, I know they're watching what other investors are saying. And one other final point here. They just joined the Principles for Responsible Investing, which is this global commitment by investors to look at ESG, environmental, social, governance, because it affects the bottom line. So they've made a commitment. They've made a personal pledge on behalf of their participants to be part of this trend. Well, that's good news. They don't have closed minds or closed ears. They may have some things they could share with you about where they're already on the move and where they're planning to go next year. That's a very valuable conversation. It's a little different than Vanguard, where we and others are trying to press them to vote their proxies more actively. On social and environmental issues, Vanguard always abstains. They don't vote for any climate resolutions, but they'll vote for a resolution on corporate governance. Why? Because they think it's good for shareholders' interests. Well, climate change is good for shareholder interests too.
Well, it does seem. I mean, it does seem at the end of the day, when you're looking at valuing any asset, it has to do with the preference that people place on that asset. So, one could argue that diamonds wouldn't be scarce if people didn't want them, no matter how few there were. So when you're looking at investments, if we project a trend in heightened investor consciousness around socially responsible investing or environmentally responsible investing, that in and of itself will drive up the value of that investment, will it not?
It certainly will expand the range of both opportunities. For example, BlackRock has recently, with its $4 trillion, has recently come out with some fossil fuel-free options for them. Now, why did they do that? Because there's a marketplace for it, right?
That's my point.
That's right. That is your point. They are responding to that marketplace, just like Goldman Sachs has and others have too. So these are the big players, right? The huge, massive players who are reading that marketplace too. I don't know if it's automatically going to pay off in short-term higher returns, but they are reading the tea leaves. And the other thing many of them are doing is they're looking at opportunities to invest in renewable energy or green bonds or things which are part of the solution in addressing climate change rather than part of the problem. And so that's the positive role that many investors are trying to play right now.
I have an interesting chart I use sometimes in class, which is the percentage of stock ownership in this country held by individual investors versus institutional investors. And if you go back a century, it was amazing. I think the perceptions that some of us still carry around in our head is it's overwhelmingly individual investors. I don't know what the statistics are today. Do you, about the percentage?
Massive majority is institutions, who, of course, they're institutions who may have your money under their umbrella, right? A mutual fund, Vanguard or BlackRock. But yes, if we are trying to get if we're trying to get votes on a shareholder resolution, you could look at the top 20 shareholders. They may own 50% plus of those shares.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting, and I think we all need to be disabused of that notion, kind of the romantic notion of the individual investor.
Let me turn that on its head, though. Okay. Fascinating that there are some individuals who sponsor shareholder resolutions with 100 shares, nothing big, who, because they've pushed the right button at the right time, they're getting votes of 50, 60, 70%.
Wow.
Now, they're getting that vote because those big institutions say, that's right, we want that too, and we endorse it as good governance.
Yeah. But what's encouraging to me, more than anything else about what you've said, is it's not the size of the lever that really matters, so much as you mentioned, the ability to make good arguments, cogent arguments, sometimes arguments that are driven by bottom line considerations when those may not be the values that are driving your commitment to a course of action. Those are, I think, good takeaways for those of us here at Western, for us to really think reflectively about. So I really appreciate your taking the time to be here with us today at a crucial time when we're considering as an institution not just about investments, but more broadly about sustainability. How are we going to take a leadership role in that space?
Well,
so thanks very much, Tim, for being here today.
A pleasure.
Greatly appreciated.